This is a presentation from the Supernaut Network.
Welcome to the Imaginarium, the show where art, technology, and creativity intersect and combine to forge a conversation that can only be found in the Imaginarium. I'm your host, Scott Colbert, and today's guest, Tim Phillips, is the Vice President of Animal Defenders International. And so welcome to the show, Tim.
Thanks very much for having me on, Scott.
If you could, give us a little bit of the background on yourself so the audience can get to know you just a little better.
Okay, well, about 30 years ago, I was working in banking, and one day I went to see a film about how animals are treated, and it was called The Animals Film. It was one of the first ever exposés of the treatment of animals in factory farming, animal experiments, circuses, for all of those things. And it really shook me, and it's fair to say it changed my life. You know, I quit the work I was doing. I went and got an SLR camera and began documenting myself the treatment of animals, and sort of got more and more engaged. And I met Jan a few years later. We were both sort of speakers on animal rights issues by then. And in 1990, we formed Animal Defenders, which began in the UK, and then by 1996 became an international organization. And the work we do is very much evidence-based. It kind of goes back to those roots of being shocked by being confronted with the evidence myself. And we're great believers that if people are given the facts and given well-supported scientific and other evidence, then they will respond to it. Sometimes it takes a while to get people to look at it and look up and notice what's around them. That's how we base our campaigns. And what ADI does is we do a very kind of complete package. We do deep undercover investigations, getting kind of copious evidence, putting people into, say, the circus industry in South America, as we did for almost 2 years, gathering evidence before we put it out there. Then we sort of do campaigns, educating, creating awareness, and we take that all the way through up to drafting legislation, and then doing what we're doing right now, which in Peru we secured a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. Just back in the last 24 hours of working on the operation down there to seize all of the wildlife from those illegal circuses. So that's something evolving at the moment, and that's kind of the work that we do.
How long were you down in Peru? And that had to have taken quite a bit of time and effort.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's sort of the best of, I think, the work that ADI does. We began the investigation project way back in 2005. 2005 to 2007, we put a team inside the circus industry, and they went everywhere, country to country, securing evidence, filming things. We filmed absolute horror, a chimpanzee being kicked and beaten with a chain, lions and tigers being beaten repeatedly during training, dogs being hit with metal bars when they were training them to perform. And we kind of put that out in several countries, 4 countries simultaneously in 2007, all of which have now banned the use of either all animals or wild animals. And there was sort of a long-running campaign building up to each of these bans. So in 2008, we had a pivotal moment in Peru where we unified the parties with 2 bills to end the use of wild animals in circuses. But it still took all the way through to 2012 to actually get that law through. Then it was passed, and they were given a certain amount of time to get rid of the wild animals. And then in April last year, we began discussions with the Peruvian authorities of how this would be enforced. And one of the key things we do is where laws are enforced, where they're most needed for animals or for environmental protection, there's often not the resources to do that. Part of what we try and do is offer that. And so we began negotiations in about April last year on how we would enforce it. Where were the circuses? Big country as well. It's bigger than Texas and California combined, and it's split by the Andes, so it's parts of it can be quite remote, has the Amazon beginning in Peru and all of those things. And we began tracking down the circuses in May that year. At the same time, if you were doing an operation like this, then in the US, for example, you'd probably liaise directly with the existing sanctuary framework or the more progressive zoos of where you would put these animals. Now, we don't have quite that infrastructure, certainly for certain species of animals down in Peru. So what ADI has to do, and we did this previously in Bolivia, is go down there, secure land, and build temporary facilities to hold significant numbers of animals. And right now we've got 21 lions that we seized from circuses in our compound in Lima, and we've got about 20 other animals, mainly monkeys and other wildlife, also held there. And so now we're embarking on the big task of getting all of those animals to their permanent homes. I apologize if I'm doing too long answers. Do tell me if I am.
No, that's fine. With what you've done down there, the animals then go to sanctuaries since they're no longer in these circuses and zoos.
That's correct. The first phase, getting them, is really tough. You've got to track them down. We've had some really pretty nasty confrontations with circuses from August through to September, and going in with the authorities. We also had to get trucks with cages on all over the country. We did seizures in Cusco where the SWAT teams and the riot police were called in, and then when you've got them, we had to travel sort of 35 hours over the top of the Andes to get them back to the temporary holding facility. So that side of it is pretty complicated and expensive. We then sort of nurture the animals to good health, ensure that they're fit, they're healthy, that they're able to travel. And then we have to secure and relocate them to the homes. So although in theory halfway through the operation, actually the biggest part of the rescue is upon us now. So we're looking after about 50 rescued animals at the moment, 9 lions in Colombia in addition to what we've got down in Peru. And we have to get those to their homes. And the lions will be coming up to Colorado, so we'll be having a flight, specially chartered flight, absolutely packed with lions. There'll be 30 lions crated up on that. Well, I think the biggest flight of its kind ever. And we hope as well to get 15 mountain lions in need of a home from Argentina onto that as well. So potentially 45 big cats will be arriving at the sanctuary in Colorado. Meanwhile, the primates, which has been a real challenge. We can't take the indigenous wildlife out of Peru, but what sanctuaries there are extremely stretched. So we've just embarked on and have launched a very big appeal to create a habitat in the Amazon forest. These animals were all torn from the wild as tiny babies. At the ADI temporary facility, we're building up the family groups already, trying to integrate capuchin monkeys with other capuchin monkeys and spider monkeys with other spider monkeys. And those animals will go to this habitat that we're building in the Amazon at an existing sanctuary. But we've got to travel them up by air, then by boat, and then return them effectively to the jungle, but in an enclosed space, I'm afraid to say, because they can't just be released back into the wild. Now, that project we're trying desperately to raise $60,000 for at the moment, so if anyone can help, go to www.ad-international.org, because it's about 15 monkeys, and 16 monkeys in fact, and several other indigenous animals, kinkajous and coati-mundis. And they're really a big add-on. That's a big rescue and relocation of wildlife that we've had to add to the rescue of all of the lions. That's where we are at the moment, and embarked on building this habitat in the jungle, because we have to keep the project moving. we have to eventually close down the temporary holding centre in just a few months. So we've taken a leap of faith and begun the groundwork for it to give these animals who've endured so much somewhere wonderful to live. But we're now pretty desperate for supporters to help us actually complete it. And, of course, get the animals there.
Well, we're going to put a link to the ADI website on the show page when the show goes up, so people can give contributions and support what I think is a very worthwhile cause.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, that's a huge help. I mean, this work is big and it's dramatic, and, when we finish this work, it'll be another country that has no more wild animals in circuses. So it's not a sticking plaster or anything like that. It's about actually eliminating an area of terrible suffering in this country. And hopefully, setting an example for other countries, including Great Britain and the United States, to actually get their act together and follow suit. So it is a very important rescue. It's beyond symbolic, I think.
I was reading on the website that you're having problems with the British circus ban.
Yes, it's tragic, really, because I think it shows how the political process can get out of step with the public will. And in Britain, I think that there is more public support for a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses than anywhere else in the world. Yet, it's an issue that Great Britain, in fact, led on. The first local authority, regional prohibitions were taking place as early as the 1970s. By the 1990s, by the mid-1990s, over 200 authorities had prohibited the use of all animals or wild animals on their land. Opinions show overwhelming support for a ban. ADI has been responsible for some of the most horrific exposés of animal abuse have been in Great Britain. In Great Britain and in the United States are probably the two places where the worst exposés have been. And that's really galvanized public opinion. Back in 2010, the government did a public consultation. In response, 97%, over 97%, of respondents said they wanted a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. And in this day and age of divisive politics, can you think of a single issue that has that kind of support? I mean, it's staggering. And if you got that kind of support clear-cut here in the US or in a South American country, you would be pretty much guaranteed for the law to go through. And we're kind of in a frustrated position back in the UK, where there's government legislation being drafted, but it's just not being put before Parliament. We did an opinion poll, and over 65% of the public thought wild animals were already banned. It's been so often talked about by the government in the media, but in fact it's never been passed. ADI has been working with a Member of Parliament and ensuring it is tabled every single week, so that it never goes off the political agenda. Now, it's almost impossible with our political process in the UK to actually pass a law privately. It has to be tabled by the government. So it just takes one person to block it each week, and one particular Member of Parliament has done that. And it falls, so we go back. And the idea is we will push this until either the government passes it or we go into a general election, all of the parties agreeing to make this a commitment. So it's not the end of the road. We're very, very close. We've got overwhelming political support. We've got a government-drafted bill, and we've got massive public support for it. So I think it will happen inevitably, but it is very, very frustrating. We do have in Great Britain a rather archaic political process, so we just have to keep soldiering on.
With that much public support, why hasn't this gone through? What, just that much amount of money to keep the politicians from wanting to pass a law banning animals in the circus?
I don't know. I mean, I think the whole thing stinks. It's as if someone's pulling favors for somebody more than anything else. If it was happening in a third world country, you would say just out and out, that's corruption. So I don't know what it is. For some reason, it keeps being sidetracked and derailed. I mean, there's sometimes legitimate political reasons. For me, animals are top of my agenda. But I do understand that things like education, health, employment, the UK's relationship with the European Union, all of those things do jostle for parliamentary time. I think that's being taken advantage of by those who don't want this thing to go through. In terms of the economics of it's insane. The British circus industry was once, probably per capita, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world, with a not dissimilar size back at the end of the 90s to the entirety of the United States at present, and with very big, powerful players, as British companies supplying Ringling Brothers and supplying Disney with animals and so on. That all changed with the huge ADI expose in 1998. I mean, it transformed the terrain. Within 6 months, half of the British animal circuses had closed. And now we're down to a very small industry. And in terms of the economics, and this is something we're very fervent about in our campaigning, in terms of the economic, the only growth area of the circus industry is the human circus. If you wanted to plan an animal circus now, especially a wild animal circus, and you went to your bank manager for a loan, he would tell you, "Are you mad?" If you went to him and said, "I want to set up a circus and I'm going to follow the Cirque du Soleil model and all of these great animal-free circuses," they'd go, "Sounds great." So in terms of the economics of it, we are left with a very tiny industry. And that actually is the same in the US. In some ways, saying we're banning this and we're banning that is perhaps misleading in economic terms, because even if you took, a big purveyor of animal acts in the United States, like Ringling Brothers, as a percentage of their show, they're only up there for, out of a 2-hour show, about 13 minutes, so about under 7% of the time. So you're really talking about a retooling of the industry. This isn't a draconian measure, as the circuses sometimes portray. Circuses will survive, continue, flourish without the animal act, without any of the animal acts, let alone without the wild animal acts. So, there's not really any coherent obstacle to this at all. Not in the UK, not in other European countries, not in the US, and not in South America and Central America.
I want to get back to something that you had mentioned earlier. Once you get the animals, then you start to transport them. You have to go, it's a 35-hour journey through the Andes Mountains. How do you prepare animals for that kind of an excursion when most of them are probably not in the best of health once you get them?
Well, actually, I mean, that's where them being circus animals kind of actually, they're used to traveling every day, every week. They don't particularly enjoy it, but it doesn't have the kind of negative impact. Perhaps, if you went and picked up a lion from the wild and tried to do that straight away, he'd go berserk. What we're doing is calming them down, keeping them warm. We put lots of bedding in there. We transfer them out of the circus cages, which can be quite hard, quite time-consuming. We don't anesthetize animals just to move them from cage to cage. So everything, because it can be so dangerous for the reasons you've just said. These can be half-starved animals. They've certainly not fit and healthy animals. They've certainly had bad diets over the years and very little exercise. So they're not fit animals. So we don't, as ADI, anesthetize animals. We patiently wait till they get hungry and move into our cages. We believe that keeping them calm is almost the top thing we can do. Many of the animals we've rescued on this operation have been really wired. They've been stressed all their lives, threatened, subjugated, and so sometimes they can be quite aggressive if cornered, just frantically running about if they think something's going to happen. And we're very successful as ADI at kind of calming these animals and getting them ready for their new home. And so all of those factors come in. We're kind of constantly checking them on the journey. By the time we get to the big relocation, when we're moving them in aviation travel crates, which are smaller, we've usually built up that trust where they're not going to be too distressed. Everything is done to keep them as calm as possible. It's all carrot work. There's no stick involved. So we'll kind of have a team who are quiet to load those animals. They'll be lured into their travel crates with food, even down to the sort of loading plan of the aircraft. What we've been doing since getting the animals in Peru, we've got very basic facilities there. They're basically sort of cages that fit on trucks that we jigsaw together in our temporary compound to give them a bit more space. But what that enables us to do is we steadily move them about until we find family groups or animals that are happy next to each other. And as I say, we've had some really quite aggressive lions come on this operation, and they've all been calmed down remarkably in just a matter of weeks, which is really very quick. They will be placed so that they can see and smell and hear their either cage mates or the animals that we know they're comfortable with when we load the aircraft. That will be the final step to them being released in Colorado, where they will have huge habitats to live in. I mean, that's the big prize in all of this, getting these lions into nice family groups, into prides, and then releasing them into sort of 10, 15 acres of lush natural habitat.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking how hard it must be to gain their trust after the years of abuse that they've suffered.
Yeah, it is a factor, and it's something we look for in members of our team, to sort of have that kind of calm demeanor. We take catnip from the US here down, and we make catnip toys. We play with them with footballs, and the lions chase the footballs. They don't last very long. They kind of bite and burst them really quickly. There's a local tree that has kind of scented, similar to pine smell, branches, and we kind of, people can go alongside their cages rubbing those, and it catches their attention. Another thing is they know they're going to be fed regularly. They're fed and they're cleaned out each day. So slowly the trust does build. I mean, I always say to our people that in some respects, the more confident these animals get, the more potentially dangerous they are. They've been subjugated and all of these things. But they do get quicker and quicker and quicker in our care. And even if they're being playful lions, then we're pretty fragile species as humans. So a big brief of ours is, especially whilst we're running a field station like we are in Peru, is safety, safety, safety. You can't risk, when you're representing the Peruvian government, to have someone get hurt or for an animal to escape. So again, that factors in to the conditions being quite rudimentary. They're good, strong cages that we know they can't reach out of and grab somebody. It is a stepping stone to them being in big habitats where they will be completely safe and away from people. But it is remarkable how just a calm demeanor, the animals knowing they're going to be fed, they're not going to be threatened, they're not going to be hurt, can sort of take these animals right down away from where they were, which was timid, scared, and as a consequence, aggressive.
And they're also highly intelligent. I mean, having gone through all that abuse and training and performing, these animals probably, I would imagine, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, are smarter than what we would see in the wild.
Oh yeah, I don't think smarter. I think they have to really live by their wits in the wild, especially in this day and age. But I think there's often a misunderstanding of, if animals can simply survive, then they're okay. And these are incredibly resilient survivors. So they can survive terrible circumstances, and it doesn't mean they're happy. And you're absolutely right. These big cats really are intelligent. They're intelligent, they're playful, they want new things, they want space to roam, and they will survive just sitting in a metal box because they are tough and resilient, but it is a terrible, terrible life. And you give them things like toys, and we went all over Lima at Christmas to get Christmas trees. And they're harder to find there than you might imagine. And so the lions got Christmas trees on Christmas Day and all of that week. And they just played and played because it was a new smell, it was a new thing. And we wrapped stuff up in wrapping paper for them to play with. We're constantly working to keep them engaged mentally and physically. They're incredibly playful animals. And everyone who comes into contact, one of the things they say about lions, because, if someone's been to the zoo, they've probably seen one poor old lion in a concrete pen or whatever. But when you get 20 plus of these animals living together and you're having to do things to entertain them, you realize what staggeringly different characters they have. I mean, if common sense tells you, of course they do. Anyone who's lived with domestic cats knows that you get two cats, they're probably quite different characters. Mm-hmm. So it's common sense, but you don't often see that, and especially not in captivity. We let their characters emerge, the dominant ones, the shyer ones, and that all helps towards building the family groups that we hope to release at the end of this project.
Well, that's a good segue into Lion Arc, I believe.
A perfect segue, I'd say.
I couldn't have planned that better, I don't think. Why don't you give us a little bit of the background on Lion Arc? I've seen some clips from it, and it's some very powerful stuff.
Yeah, well, Lion Arc is the feature-length documentary about the ADI rescue of all the Bolivian circus animals. And Jan and I went out there to lead the ADI team, and it had never been done before that a strong animal rights, strong animal welfare law had been passed in this way, and then it was going to be radically enforced. And the circuses were given a year to change their ways. A year went by. One circus handed over their animals to ADI to relocate. We did that. Everybody else defied the law. And they just thought, no one's ever going to enforce this. And so about 6 months after the ban should have been fully implemented, we went back and we began tracking down the circuses. And in all, we raided 8 circuses all over Bolivia. And so Jan and I began filming it from the beginning of this sort of whole adventure. We filmed at cinema quality. It just emerged, this sort of amazing story. And what it did was enable, we felt, people to get up close and personal with these lions, and that we could tell the story of how they suffered, but with a really happy ending. So we found we didn't need to, as we were seeing the film we were gaining, it was very dramatic because there was confrontations with circuses. They'd try and hide animals. We'd pursue them through the mountains. You also didn't need to sort of beat people over the head with the suffering of these animals, because when you saw them first get hay bedding, it was so emotional seeing them play and roll about in it. That was what told you, oh my God, they were just in completely bare boxes with nothing. And then when they got their first toys, and then by the end of the film, they're running into these massive enclosures, the biggest of which was 25 acres, and running and playing and very much going from these sort of broken creatures to being lions again. We took it onto the film festival circuit, and it's very much edited as a sort of action adventure. Everything's live in it. We used conversations and talk as it actually happened. When, for example, Jan's talking about the impact of captivity on a lion and how they become stereotypic, then she's looking straight into the eyes of a lioness she's just rescued. So it has a real sort of urgency and a kind of closeness, and the sort of the heartache when animals are suffering through to the sort of joy of seeing them released. And so we took the film onto the festival circuit, opening at Rain Dance and then Mill Valley Film Festival. It just got a fantastic response. It's won 6 awards now. It was nominated for an NAACP award because they felt it was such a positive representation, how different cultures come together to help animals. It's just been sold into distribution with ITV Global. So we're doing a few more festivals here in the US, and we're doing a mini theatrical run with it in April, and then it will be available through TV and video on demand around the world.
One of the things that impresses me about ADI and what I've seen is it doesn't rely on a lot of exploitative film work. As you mentioned, it's more, you kind of understand going in that it's about abused animals, so you don't really need to show that like other organizations tend to do. And I think that really helps the cause quite a bit.
Yeah, I think there's a place for sort of showing, I think that there's a place for showing the suffering. I think you have to go to legislators if you want to prohibit something and say, here it is, look at it, the proof, this is a huge volume of abuse. Because if you want something, a law passed saying that can never happen again, and not be kind of moderated, we are going to stop that behavior. You need a volume of evidence. What we felt with Lionark was we had this sort of unique opportunity to tell a story that didn't pull its punches, but had a happy ending, that we didn't sort of pummel people into submission that this is our point we're making. We're going to hit you with animal suffering until you give up. I think as well people liked that it was a very kind of honest representation. We showed the reactions of the circuses and how they were when we went and got the animals and things like that. So I think that really resonated with people. It's certainly gone down really well with audiences, and we hope it will be seen by more and more people.
One of the animals that you featured in Lion's Ark is Kimba,
yes.
who sadly has passed away fairly recently.
Yes, just last week, I'm sad to say. We did shed a few tears last week about dear old Kimba.
You want to talk about Kimba a little bit for the audience who may not have seen the movie yet?
Kimba's one of the big stars of Lionark, and in a way he sort of symbolizes a certain type of animal. There's a line in the film when we're going down to rescue Kimba, and Jan says Kimba was one of those animals the world forgot, dumped by a circus 10 years ago in a town called Tarika, and that's where he stayed. And he was this lion who pretty much the circus took the best years of his life, and he was then dumped in this little zoo, who, to their credit, took him, but really didn't have the space and were very willing to hand him over. And he lived in a concrete box for over 11 years, and he never heard a lion's voice. And I think, whenever you see a solitary lion in a zoo or a circus, just remember these are social animals like us, much more so than tigers or something. These are animals that talk, groom, want to be together. We flew down to Tarika to get this animal in a really battered old C-130 Hercules, who it seen service in the Vietnam War. So it's a quite exciting scene getting down there. And we got there, and he was effectively bricked into his enclosure. There was no way of getting him. We smashed down a wall, we cut through the cage bars, and we finally got him out. And we then flew him back up to Santa Cruz. It was nighttime by the time we got him to the lion compound, and he was the last lion on the operation, and he was sort of almost an add-on. And he was an old man even then. He was well over 15, and he was possibly older. And he was half blind. He'd gone half blind in there, and this was the point his life was going to begin. And he'd never heard in all those years another lion's voice. And he arrived in the compound. He was a very vocal lion, Kimba, and he roared. And of course, 20 plus lions roared back, and it was just amazing. And he would just keep roaring, and of course all these voices would roar back, and they all communicated in this little compound. And we flew him back with all the lions to Colorado, and it was quite hard to integrate him with others because he was so half blind, and the one eye completely dried up eventually and was fully blind in it. And over the next years, as I say, he was an old lion and made older by his circumstance. He was slowly, in this past year, began to lose sight in his second eye. But they found an old lioness in Mexico, and she moved in with him. So his last years were the happiest of his life, and finally last week he became completely blind, and he began to suffer with the pain of his eye, and he was peacefully put to sleep. And he really was a sort of grand old lion, and all through his last years he would roar to every new lion arriving at the sanctuary. And he is definitely one of the big favourites from the film Lionarch. I mean, he symbolises so much, that it is worth it for those few years of sunshine and joy at the end of a tough life.
There's such a dignity to his story.
I agree, and I think that comes out with a few of the lions. The other big character in Lionarch, when I was directing the film, I said to the cameraman, film every lion every day. I can't tell you now who's going to be the big stars of the film, and somebody might not make it or get injured or pass away on the flight. You're dealing with animals who've been through a lot. And slowly the other huge character in the film is a lion called Colo Colo, who was just incredibly aggressive and defiant. He just never lost his fight. He'd been in this one cage for 12 years, just shut in there. It was rusted shut. And at one point in the film, Jan and I have to try and get him out of it into a bigger enclosure. And he is just powering to try and attack and kill us. And he became, despite the fact he was so aggressive, this real hero of the compound, the lion who never gave up his fight. And I think very different in character to Kimber, but very similar in sort of majestic and dignified. And, these old warrior lions, they really sort of take everything that's thrown at them and retain a majesty and an impressiveness.
What would you say to someone who might discount what they might consider the anthropomorphization of these lions and the other animals that you help, and have this idea that, well, this has been going on for decades, why now? What's the big deal? How do you change somebody's mind who has that ideology?
I think that quite the reverse of being anthropomorphic, because we sort of see animals for their differences, and we understand that they want companionship of their own kind. And solitary animals or nocturnal animals want to be there at night, and solitary animals want to be solitary, and social animals want to socialize. And I think that those who use the anthropomorphic argument tend to sidestep that completely. And in fact, a group like ADI isn't saying these animals share our emotion, they're identical or anything. We're saying we should respect their differences. We should respect them as animals in their own right. And what do they really need to give them any quality of life? And I think in terms of this has been going on for years. I mean, those sorts of arguments were used to defend slavery, to prevent women having the vote, to, every injustice which has ever finally been stopped has been obstructed with arguments of this is the way it's always been. And I think that we are at a key time socially where we are learning to respect the needs of animals. And I think it's very significant that around the world, 30 countries have prohibited either all animals in circuses or wild animals. And if you just take a moment to look at those circuses, you could sort of say in Europe, you've got kind of modern industrial economic powers like Austria and other European countries like Portugal, Greece, Croatia, Belgium, Czech Republic. And then if you cross over, in Asia, countries that say a small country like Taiwan and Singapore have started bringing in these measures. A huge country like India that's prohibited wild animal acts. And you come across to South America. And even the differences between those countries in South America, Bolivia, a very agrarian country, very socio-economically different to Peru, even though it's a neighbor, which is a much more industrialized country. And also Colombia is now banned, and Paraguay, and up in Central America, Panama, El Salvador, Costa Rica, who's perhaps predictable, but then in the last months of last year, Mexico passed a ban. I mean, a massive country with a massive circus industry saying this shouldn't happen. And these are all such different socio-economic countries, and they're all coming to the conclusion that we should not do this to these majestic animals just to amuse ourselves. And it may be a huge leap further from that to being sort of a more animal rights world, but it is very significant that we are drawing the line all over the world and saying we shouldn't modify this behavior. We just should not do this at all to these wild animals just to amuse ourselves. I think it's inevitable that countries like the United States and the UK will follow suit, and it's a shame they're not leading the charge. And we're seeing something change everywhere. And I think that we will look back on, in hundreds of years' time, how we enslaved and treated animals and say, what on earth were we thinking of? Well, how did we ever allow those things to happen to our planet? But we're at least on that ladder starting to change things now.
Have you ever come across a circus or any kind of a zoo that have treated their animals humanely?
Yeah, there is no right way for a travelling circus, because you've got animals in temporary accommodation for the entire year, and you just cannot look after big animals, especially horses, zebras, certainly not elephants, lions, tigers, bears, in accommodation that can fit on a truck every week. You just cannot do it. And from that point spring all of the abuses. They have to be close controlled and dominated in order to get them in trucks every week, in order to get them in the circus ring, in order to make them perform in a way that simply does not happen in zoos, even generally the worst zoos. And that's not to say there's not need for reform there. So the very industry itself brings about all of the abuses. It's no accident that there's definitely been recorded physical abuse of animals in zoos caught on camera. But there are hundreds of thousands of zoos in the world, millions probably. And yet, of the circuses, which are relatively low numbers per country, say 30 or 40 across the US, say 20 across Peru a few years ago, the staggering amount of physical violence caught on camera, it's out of all proportion to the size of the industry. The industry itself and the nature of the work, and that's why only a prohibition is successful, causes the abuse, the suffering, and the hardship of these animals. I would say that there are some people in circuses who a genuine affection for the animals, but it's coloured by a complete misunderstanding of their needs. I mean, just an incomprehension. It's like someone in an abusive relationship who occasionally is kind and buys presents for their abused partner. It's a misunderstanding at best of what these animals really need. In terms of zoos and other captivity, I think we need to reevaluate completely why we're putting animals in cages. There will, for all the rest of our lifetime, be wildlife that needs a home, that can't just simply be returned to the wild. You know, for example, an animal that's confiscated off a drug dealer. Someone gets a tiger off a drug dealer, say, or a bear that walks into the road and gets hit by a truck and loses a paw or something. Those animals will always need sanctuary, and there will be illegal traffickers and things. I think what we need to address is, are we simply putting animals in cages and deliberately perpetuating it just to amuse ourselves, when we have TV, the internet, and we have travel on a scale that was just unthinkable in even our parents' generation, and it will continue to expand. So we have to ask, are we just deliberately breeding animals and putting them in an unnatural environment just to amuse people? And I think the future is far, far less of zoos and sanctuaries that specialize on looking after certain animals instead of stockpiling as many different species for people to gawp at as possible. I think that's something that the public will embrace as well. And here in the US, there are certain zoos starting to follow that model already, who are saying, okay, we're up in Detroit. We shouldn't have elephants anymore. We'll hand those over to a sanctuary. We'll focus on animals that need help, are suited to this climate, like polar bears in need, rescued polar bears. So I think those changes will come. I think, to quickly answer your question, for the animals in circuses, there is no humane way of doing it. It's absolutely impossible, and it just leaves a trail of suffering and abuse as a result of it. For other wildlife in captivity, a very radical reevaluation and change is needed.
Wow, that was so well said. I'm going to wrap this up by asking, donating to ADI aside, which I urge everybody to do, what can people do to help?
Well, I think that people should get involved in trying to secure the laws that will really help animals, that contact, your city councillors and say, why don't, push for wild animals in circuses or even all animals to be prohibited from your city. And also get in touch with your members of Congress about the Travelling Exotic Animal Protection Act, which would bring the United States in line with all other countries. This is a big federal issue. The American circuses travel from state to state to state. They can stay on the road for the entire year, whereas in many other countries, the circuses, because of the climate, at least get a breather off the road for a few months. People often feel hopeless about influencing the political process, but they shouldn't do. Members of Congress, a phone call from you may not put the issue at the top of their agenda, but it pencils it onto the agenda. And another call and hearing the information. And these politicians want to hear from people who are reasonable with reasoned arguments. And I would say, make the effort. They know if you're making the effort. They know that an online petition anyone can sign in 15 seconds. They know that if you pick the phone up and say, I would really like to come and see you when you're in your constituency office or when I'm in DC in the coming month, they know that takes effort. They know it means something. And if you present the case, this is tried and tested in all the countries that have passed these laws or any other animal laws. Get involved, get engaged, and help. And people can help with ADI on protests at circuses, disseminating our information and literature to schools in their area, to veterinary surgeries. They can volunteer on some of our rescue projects. We've got volunteers down there in Peru at the moment. So there's a multitude of different ways. I mean, I like to think that Animal Defenders International, an empowering organization, will try and give people the tools to get laws in their area and to help animals, to really make a difference themselves. And people shouldn't forget that they can change their own life to be more compassionate. They can buy the products that aren't tested on animals. They can find out about it from ADI. They can go vegan or vegetarian and stop eating animals, or even begin straight away reducing their intake of those products. So there's a mass of different ways in your personal life where you can actually help animals. I mean, going vegetarian or vegan instantly saves animals. So, don't be frightened of it. Give it a go.
That sounds like some good advice. And Tim, I really appreciate you coming on. It's been very informative. And as I said before we started recording, I was looking forward to this interview particularly because I am a big animal lover, and I really fully support everything that ADI does. And I hope that others who are listening to the show support you as well.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. I do feel I've talked at great length. I sometimes do interviews where I've got my snappy sound bites. So I appreciate you've let me go on and on and on.
On a podcast, there are no sound bites. I like to let the guests talk for as long as they want to talk, because I find that's more important to get that out than anything I may have to say or making a snappy sound bite. So,
well, I think that this is the most important way now to discuss these issues. I think, as someone who's a bit of a veteran of campaigning, and, back in the 70s and 80s, just tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, which is the soundbite, animals are suffering, animals are being abused. Did you know that they cram this many chickens in a factory farm? I think that was important. I think now we're in the era where we're looking for solutions to these things instead of just shouting as loudly as possible that there is a problem. I think there's a place for shouting loudly that there's a problem. But I think as well, we need to keep taking the debate to the next level. So Jan, myself, and ADI, we really enjoy the chance to actually explain that there is a coherent path here. It isn't about, a law's going to be passed tomorrow and we're all going to have to go vegan and, the economy's going to collapse or something, as some of our opponents portray. There are solutions to these problems and changes in attitudes to animals that are clearly needed and can move forward.
And on that note, we'll have links on the show page where you can find out more about ADI and ways that you can support it. And if you enjoy the Imaginarium, check out our other shows on the Supernauts Network at thesupernauts.com. And until next time, may all your journeys be filled with pure imagination.